Okay, so I'll just introduce myself now because I lose the Zoom visibility after I start presenting. So my name is Kara Jones. I'm a Mojave Desert archaeologist. Um, I'm a grad student at UNLV. I am in my 5th year, which is wild to think about. Um, and as I've gone through my graduate program, I've really started to focus on Holocene Lakeshore adaptations, focusing on like subsistence shifts and mobility shifts as people are responding to a changing climate. And this just kind of blossomed as I was doing my master's thesis research, where I'm actually a lithic specialist. That's what I came into grad school having a specialization in. And that's where my familiarity is. And this project really like pushed the bounds of what my specialty was, and has, I think it's made me a much more well-rounded archaeologist, which is lovely, but it was a process to get here. So I just want to say thank you all for being here, and thank you for being interested in some really interesting old lake food. So I'm going to cut my video now and share my screen. Excellent. So my research is titled Shifting Subsistence Along the Lakeshore, Surf and Turf at Ivanpah, California. And this is my master's thesis research. This is just a subsection of it focused entirely on subsistence. So in this presentation, there's a lot of information, but there's also a lot of pictures. So I figured it would be good to just give you guys a general outline. So the format, I'm going to cover the environment of where Ivanpah Dry Lake is, in case anyone's not familiar. Review just briefly some of the past work that's been done in the area. I'll go over the subsistence patterns that are visible at Ivanpah Dry Lake and how that correlates to land use. And then I will conclude everything and have some future directions that are going there. So Ivanpah Dry Lake is located in the Mojave Desert, as is Las Vegas. So the Mojave Desert is in the southwestern corner of the Great Basin in the Basin and Range province. The most notable things about the Mojave Desert is that we have long winter freezes and high summer temperatures. But the Mojave Desert is unique in that there are 2 different climatic schemes that exist in it, where the western Mojave is in a rain shadow desert because of the Sierra Nevada mountains and is generally hotter and drier with less precipitation, where the eastern Mojave receives a lot of moisture from the Colorado Desert. And we are lucky over here to have summer monsoons, which have been really lovely in the past couple of years, considering all of the droughts that we've been through. And just, this is a map of actually dry season precipitation that's here. And you can see that there's just a clear boundary down the middle where the climactic scheme kind of separates. So the plants in the Mojave Desert, so Ivanpah is right here. That's kind of important. So Ivanpah is right along the California-Nevada border, and you drive through it on Interstate 15. So something that everyone sees when they are driving through there are the horrid, they look like, I call them the Eye of Sauron towers, but they're photovoltaic towers, and they glow at the top, and they're actually so bright that you can't really look at them for that long. And this is because it's superheated plasma at that point, and it's just insanely bright. And that is how you know that you were at Ivanpah Dry Lake. So the plants in the Mojave Desert are generally 60 to 70% creosote scrub. And that's on this vegetation and land cover map. That's all of the tan. So that's just desert shrub, which is most of it. But Ivanpah is really unique in that you have 2 different woodlands that are surrounding it. You have conifer woodland at higher elevations up in the Clark Mountains and the Mescal Range. And you also have desert woodland at lower elevations. So you have these different biotic resources that are available in this area that are generally not available in the Mojave Desert. So the data set for this land cover map is overwhelmingly that tan color. So these little pockets of woodland that are really diverse are very, very rare. So the Ivanpah Valley, like I mentioned, is along the California-Nevada border near Primm. So Primm is actually built kind of on the very top, the most northern portion of Ivanpah Dry Lake. And you can see to the north of Ivanpah on the Nevada side is Roach Dry Lake. So it's important because these lakes are actually treated as completely separate lakes when that is not the case, which I will get to shortly. So Ivanpah Dry Lake is bound by the Clark, Lucy Gray, and Mescal Mountains. So the Lucy Gray Mountains are on the east, and the Clark and Mescal Range are on the west. So Ivanpah is also in an internally draining basin. And what that means is that when water comes in, it doesn't leave. So there's no outlet channels that the water can follow. Whereas if anyone is familiar with Silver Lake and Soda Lake, which coalesced in the Pleistocene to Lake Mojave, which was a giant lake. So that connects to the Mojave River and the Mojave Delta. So that has a drain. Whereas Ivanpah, all the water that comes in just stays there. And something else with this internally draining basin is that the topography is not level. So the south end of the lake is a higher elevation than the north end of the lake. So when this lake is completely full, that means that the northern portion of the lake has the deepest water. And as it dries, the southern boundary is what dries first, and then it encroaches up to the north. Additionally, there's an abundance of alluvial activity that is here. So if you're not familiar with what an alluvial fan is, it's a basically sediment erosion off of mountains. And you can see a really good one. I can't remember which button it is for the, whoop, nope, not that. Anyways, there's a laser pointer button that's here, and I don't know what it is visible. So we'll just do this. So there's a great fan that's right here, and this is the Lucy Gray fan, and it looks like an actual fan. So you can see where it drains out, and then there's the boundary that's right here. So Ivanpah was originally thought to have been dry since the beginning of the Holocene and the end of the Pleistocene. So people kind of treated it as this forever dry lake during the Holocene. However, that is not the case. So some recent geologic research conducted by Spaulding and Sims discovered 2 Holocene high lake stands and an additional terminal Pleistocene early Holocene high lake stand as well. So the dates for those lake stands are here. And the most recent one was only 1,000 years ago. So pretty recent if you're talking about this lake that originally all of the archaeology was interpreted that this area just had been dry since the end of the Pleistocene, but there have been multiple high lake stands and lake fill events. So the discovery of Ivanpah as a paleolake was discovered through excavation rather than surface visual cues, although there's a couple surface visual cues that are available. And the excavation was important because, as I had mentioned, there's a lot of alluvial activity. And what that means is that all of this deposition of sediment has kind of obscured the actual boundary of the lake. And you can see with this boundary that is drawn over the lake here, there's a lot of material from this lake that's under all of the sediment that's accumulated. So generally, the eastern portion of Ivanpah has been designated as being more culturally sensitive, where there's a lot more archaeological sites. And the western portion has less archaeology, but is more heavily impacted by industry. So the eastern portion does have some industry impacts. Most notably is the Lakeshore mine, which you will hear more about later, as well as the railroad that runs along the edge. There's also indigenous trails that cross through the Ivanpah Valley, which are very important, and these connect to villages that were in Pahrump, Mesquite, and Good Springs valleys. So looking at some of the surface cues that are here, you have an alpha longshore basin, and that's there's 2 of them. There's one here and another one here, and these form through wave activity and some sediment accumulation and deposition. And there are multiple meters of height difference between these. So the kind of bar that's in the middle is much higher than these basins. And that only forms through a lot of water. So you can think of these kind of as a miniature version of the Central Valley of California, which also was at one point an ocean. So you have all of the accumulation of sediment on the edges, and then you have this valley depression. Additionally, there's beaches that are visible, and you can see that as this kind of grayish material that's here as opposed to the dry lake playa. So that's fine sediment deposition through wave activity as well. Previous research that has been done in the area is all through industry projects. So there hasn't been any independent archaeology that's been done here. So the most notable projects include the Ivanpah Solar Electric Generating Station. So that's the picture on the bottom with the super bright towers that roast birds out of the sky. The Intermountain Power Project, Cal Coal, which is a coal slurry line. The Barstow to Vegas motorcycle race, which is the top right picture, very fun. So all off-road, and it goes from Barstow to Vegas, which involves some work by the BLM for site recording in case there's any impacts, more transmission lines, and 2 mines, which are Molycorp Mine and Coliseum Mine. So this is a whole lot of different projects that have gone on. And the issue is that all of this information has been locked up in gray literature. So gray literature is work that's been done usually by industry projects where they have a report deliverable for a project to go forward. And that stays with whatever agency they report to. And in this case, my data came from the BLM. So they get all of these reports and the public doesn't get to learn anything about it. And because there's all of these reports from different projects, it's kind of a piecemeal approach. So the Ivanpah area has only been analyzed in these little chunks of land based on where the area of potential effect is for any project, rather than evaluated as a whole landscape. One of the best and most important resources that's come out of this, however, is by Bean et al. In 1982. And they did a Native American place name and trail study as part of this project. So we have, this is just a map of a little bit of the Mojave Desert. So their boundary study area is the dashed line. And you have indigenous place names for all of these different locations, some of which are current, they're actually like current towns and cities. So we have Las Vegas, which is all the way up to the top. And then we have a couple that are of the very high importance for my research, which is Ivanpah, so Ivanpah, which is on here. And you also have Ivanpah or Spirit Mountain, which just got National Monument status recently, which is just over a little bit. And as I'm talking about these trails that cross through the region, these are actually mapped. So you have the Salt Song Trail, which comes down from Las Vegas south, and you have the Southern Fox Song Trail, which cuts kind of northwest, going up toward Pahrump. So these are just some important aspects that are on this map. So through all of my research, I compiled the location of all of the sites that were within the lake boundary. So there's a couple that are outside of the lake boundary. I'm not including those for discussion here because I'm looking at the site adaptations in response to this constantly shifting lake. So I'm going to be looking at sites that are within that paleolake boundary. So I discovered 65 sites in total, 59 within the paleolake boundary. And for a master's thesis project, this was an enormous amount of data that I ended up getting that I was not expecting to get this much. So because there were so many sites, I really needed to have some kind of classification for them so I could parse them all out. So I created 4 different categories. There's thermal use sites. These are sites that have the little fire symbol in them, and they have thermal features. So I'm calling them thermal features because I don't know exactly what they were roasting or cooking. So there's no excavation that I've done. This is all just a couple surface surveys and all gray literature. So non-destructive archaeology. So any thermal use site has at least one thermal feature in it. Logistical use sites are generally those that have lithic reduction present. So any kind of flake scatter, a lot of like lithic tools, or they are sites that have an abundance of brownstone, which is often associated with thermal sites, but no thermal features. There's also intermediate use sites. So intermediate use sites are ones that share the same concept of thermal use and logistical use, but there's a lot of overlap. So there will be some thermal features, an abundance of flakestone, as well as a lot of groundstone. And then there's other use sites. So there's only a handful of these, and these are basically just sites that like fall out of bounds for the categories that I've created here. And each category generally is representative of different subsistence patterns as well. And there's some spatial use correlation that is going on here as well. So thermal processing sites, there's 28 of them, which include at least 106 thermal features that have been recorded. So I say at least 106 because during our ground recon surveys, we found a series of sites that haven't been recorded, and there's 56 of those. So, and this is just with one chunk again, so the whole lake really needs to be surveyed completely. And so I just want to separate that these are not formally recorded. We have recorded them at UNLV, so it was myself, my advisor, and some of my fellow grad students, but they need to be completely written up and submitted to the BLM so they have some geospatial data. Like I mentioned, I'm not entirely sure what they are roasting. Clearly, these are fire-cracked rock features, so there is something that they're processing there. And it probably was confusing for people to interpret what this was, as they were assuming that this area had been barren of vegetation, as it is now. However, when you're trying to picture what it would look like as a wetland, there's a lot more options for what they could have been cooking. So some possible resources include tule potato, cattails, great bulrush, beaver dam breadroot, and palmate leaf gourds. So these are some common wetland resources in the Mojave Desert. And the thermal features have a couple different appearances. Sometimes they are very large and diffuse, like the one that has the person standing in it. That's Rosina, who is helping with recording. Some of them are small, like the small scatter on the bottom right. And generally, they would have had a much tighter grouping, and they're approximately 1 meter in diameter. The logistical use sites that have flakestone assemblages with them were probably used for hunting. So there's not a ton of these sites that are there, but the intensity of hunting use at Ivanpah could be skewed by artifact collecting. So in the reports that I was reading, one of them was conducted by Malcolm Rogers in the 20s, and even Malcolm Rogers in 1920, so 100 years ago, had mentioned that Ivanpah Dry Lake was a very popular destination for artifact collecting. So people would go there to collect projectile points and to collect ceramics. So ceramics are present at Ivanpah, but are fairly rare. And again, that is probably skewed from artifact collecting. So the projectile point chronology suggests that this area has been repeatedly used for hunting activities for over 10,000 years. So we have the most recent, this little cute desert side notch point that's in my advisor, Barb Roth's hand. We have a gypsum point that's up in the top right corner, an archaic point that is unknown because it's a medial section that's there. But we do have a paleo point, which is in the bottom right-hand corner, and that was found by Rosina. And this is also, this was on her first survey that she had been on, and also is the first artifact that the first projectile point she had ever found in the field. So that's kind of a hard first experience to ever top, and we were very jealous, and I bought her some donuts afterward as a congratulations. So while we've been doing these ground recon surveys, we found these really bizarre linear features. And of course, you always find the coolest things when you're out on survey and doing work at the very last minute. So during our first ground recon, that's when we found the linear features. So we have the one that I use for my title slide for this presentation that is by the map. And after we returned a second time, we found a lot more. So these kind of come in two different forms. There's the linear features that are fairly narrow and long. So only a couple courses wide, like 1 to 3, and they extend for quite a great deal. And there's these other ones that are really wide and tend to be shorter. So we found this on the eastern edge in a basalt outcrop. So these rocks have been eroding out of the Lucy Gray fan, the one that I had mentioned earlier. And the Lucy Gray Mountains are igneous bearing. So these rocks are just kind of tumbling and eroding out as time goes on. So the eroding quarry area where the fan is in yellow, and where all of these features are is the circled area that is in blue. So just to the south, we found some more interesting stuff, and we found another outcrop of igneous rocks. That's why I went over there, because it looked interesting. And then as I was looking at all of the boulders that were eroding out, I noticed some patterns, and there were some circular features that were definitely culturally created. So some of them are pretty clear, like the one in the bottom left-hand corner, and then there's some that are a little more ephemeral, like the one in the bottom right. And the one in the bottom right might actually be multiple circular features, so that is a possibility. But they tend to have these piles of boulders that are located adjacent to the circular features as well. And I knew at this point that I needed to go through some literature and kind of figure out what they are, because Barb had been mentioning that they looked really similar to some features that had been found out at Silver Lake and Soda Lake. So what were these used for? My argument is that they were used for shrimp. So the shrimp in question here, they're generally called phyllopod. There's a lot of different kinds of these shrimp. There's brine shrimp, tadpole shrimp, fairy shrimp, and also clamshell shrimp. So they all look a little bit different. However, the taxa that is native to Ivanpah is a tadpole shrimp. So they look like miniature little horseshoe crabs. And phyllopod are unique in that their eggs are viable for 15 years. However, they can only spawn and hatch their eggs after the soil has been completely dry. So after they lay their eggs aren't going to hatch then. It'll be the next time that the ground has dried out completely and some rains come through and rehydrate the soil. So these are hardy little guys. The eggs are generally immune, I guess, or they're hardy against freezing temperatures, intense heat, and extreme aridity. Additionally, I did a little bit of extra research about them, and they have some resistance to radiation as well. So they have been a possible food source, which has been being researched by NASA for the International Space Station. So very cool to think that these might be a food source for astronauts. And they've been utilized for a long time. They've been utilized by the Mono Paiute, the Goshute, the Great Salt Lake peoples, as well as indigenous Mexicans. So this is a niche but fairly well-documented food source. They're also very sensitive, and they're sensitive to shadows and turbidity. So catching them is really difficult because they will pick up on any disturbance and then they will scatter away. So they're really small. Also, they're only about an inch long in the case of tadpole shrimp. So when they leave, it is hard to catch them again. So these linear piers and the platforms can kind of help negate or minimize these effects of shadows and turbidity when it comes to capturing them. The circular features are the most advantageous because you capture them in the cyst catchment. So you'll build these features in the event that there is coming rain, and as the rain comes and these tadpole shrimp hatch, then you kind of have them all in one place and you don't have to worry about how difficult they are to catch. So there was a shrimp camp hypothesis that was put forth by Henriksen et al. In 1998, in that you can archaeologically identify areas that tadpole shrimp were targeted by a couple of criteria. So you need to have rock features such as these piers, benchmarks, or the circle or oval catchments. Obviously, playa is ideal because that's usually where brine shrimp or tadpole shrimp hatch, as well as the presence of milling equipment. So you might be thinking like, oh, well, after you catch them, then how do you eat them? So There was some thought that maybe the thermal features could have been used for that, but there have been some studies that have been done that show that brine shrimp are actually pretty easily processed on milling equipment by grinding them into a paste, in case you want some shrimp paste. Or in the case of the Salt Lake peoples, they would just let the lake, because it's so briny, do its job, and these shrimp would wash up on the shore. They would dry because of the salt, and then you can collect them and again grind them into a powder or probably eat them whole. So an overview of the features, there's the linear alignments, and they are present here at Ivanpah, as well as the Snake River Plain of Idaho and Silver Lake, California, which is just a couple of dry lakes over. There's the circles and ovals, which are present here at Ivanpah and also at Silver Lake. And so there's probably a regional trend that's happening here. So here's the location of these comparative studies. And what I've been working on kind of as a side project is whenever I present on this, I get a couple people who will usually talk to me and be like, oh, hey, I was out at this lake here and I saw some similar features that are there, and we haven't really known what they are. So I have a couple of lakes that just from word of mouth, I can kind of fill in between the Snake River Plain and Ivanpah. So obviously that's a huge distance. However, because here in Nevada, we have the basin and range topography, there are numerous dry lakes that are in between here. So I think that this is a very regional adaptation and is going to be very prevalent archaeologically. And this is just some comparison between the studies. So these are the features that are at Silver Lake, where you have a circle catchment and you have a pier that's there. And we have the same things here at Ivanpah, and out at the Snake River Plain of Idaho. And at Ivanpah, you have those rock alignments. So generally for the rock alignments, for the piers and the benchmarks, they're going to extend from the boundary of the lake and then go into the interior. So all of this kind of gives you an idea of climatic reconstruction that you can do, because using brine shrimp or tadpole shrimp wouldn't have been possible if the lake was full. So when the lake was dry, this could have been a way to still have the lake playa as a productive food resource. So is Ivanpah a shrimp camp? I would say probably yes, because it's an ephemeral lake. There's abundant groundstone. You have all three different kinds of constructed features. And there's also ceramics. So the ceramic here is this guy that is over here. And the ceramics that exist out at Ivanpah generally look like that. That is a sherd that is lower Colorado buffware. So that's paddle and anvil constructed. The kinds of pottery that we have here in the Mojave Desert is usually done by coil and scrape, and that's brownware. So instead of how this is like a sandy buff color, it'll just be brown. And we also have T-zone brownware, which is a brownware. However, it's paddle and anvil made too. So you can usually see those like paddle marks that are on the actual sherd. And they're probably only able to be found out at Ivanpah because they blend in with the ground. So anything that was painted that was eye-catching has probably already been picked up. So this is just an assortment of the different pieces that we found out at Ivanpah. We have this Metate fragment. There's a couple monos, another Metate fragment. Someone probably stacked these two together, which is nice, but now I mean, it's out of context, but it was still nice to know that it's there. So like this area really needs to be resurveyed, especially looking for artifacts, because when we went out to look for these features, we were only looking for the features. We weren't there to do a complete field recording of associated artifacts along with it as well. So now that we know all of the different resources that are available, what do they mean all together? So I did some geospatial tests utilizing ArcGIS Pro to see what the geospatial distribution of all of the sites were. So that's a lot of words for me to say. Where were all of the sites, and is it statistically significant where they're grouped? So this is a heat map, which is nice and very intuitive, and it shows just the hot zones of where all of these sites are located. So you have a patch that's up in the north, one on the east boundary, one on the west boundary, and then a lot going on in the south. And as I mentioned about the varying topography there, so the lake, when it's full, extends the whole valley. And as it starts to dry out, it starts to creep north. And that chunk that's in the south makes a lot of sense because it has a north to south trend. So as the lakeshore recedes, people are following that lake and they're constructing sites and harvesting resources that are shrinking through this lake. So the favored areas are the south and the margins. Generally, the logistical or hunting sites tend to be in the north, whereas the thermal and plant processing sites tend to be in the south. And keeping the topography in mind, that makes a lot of sense. So as the lake kind of starts to recede while there's less water, the southern end of the lake would have been a really nice wetland patch. So even when the lake seems to be like maybe it was dry or kind of condensed toward the north, the water table there is pretty shallow, so it's still going to be able to support this wetland climate. So the thermal use sites are what I use as a marker for how long the lake was there. So because the thermal use sites are going to be directly tied to these wetland resources. So thermal use continues through time until the modern climate conditions are reached. So when the lake is completely dry, there's not enough water to sustain this wetland resource, and then the lake is probably abandoned for use. And possibly there's a shift to go to harvesting shrimp instead, relying on those ephemeral rains. So hunting would have been, you would think like, oh, well, you can still use the lake to hunt on when it's dry, but you're going to have less animals that are going to be visiting the lake to get water. And also a lot of small game is going to prefer these like wetland margin grasses and shrubs that are there. And as that dries out and there's less vegetation, there's not really any room to hide. And it's a little bit more dangerous to be there if you were a small critter. So if we put a lot more data onto that heat map, you can kind of see how everything is going on. So these shifting resource patches are showing shifting subsistence practices. So you can see where all of the logistical sites are, the little blue dots, and those tend to be in the north. The western cluster has a little bit of everything going on. However, the thermal and intermediate use sites tend to stop right about here. And the intermediate sites are kind of lumped in with the thermal use sites for wetland resource use as well, because the intermediate use sites have groundstone and presumably they are grinding and processing plants that are there. And the two little other use sites that are up here, those are pot drops. So those are just pottery scatters where a vessel was either accidentally or intentionally dropped. And then this is where all of the little shrimp sites is on the boundary. So at about this level is when the lake would have been considerably dry. So I've mentioned a lot of trails and trade that cut through this region as well. So Ivanpah has a really special place in the heart and cultural memory of indigenous people in this area, including the Nuwuvi, Southern Paiute, and the Chemehuevi. So the southern band of the Southern Paiute, or western band of the Southern Paiute, excuse me, are known as the Paranai, meaning the people with their feet in the water. So water being present is alive in the cultural memory of these people as well. And the name Ivanpah actually comes from the Nuwuvi and Chemehuevi term meaning good, clear water. So this place is known for having water available for quite a long time. So the Salt Song Trail is the one which goes south, and it was used for a lot of different practices. It's probably the most sacred trail that's in this region or in the West. The most prominent use of the trail is actually for the cry, and the cry is the funeral trail that brings a departed person's soul to the afterlife, which ends at the mouth of the Grand Canyon. This trail is also used for togetherness, so getting people together for different celebrations, and it covers a lot of area. So it covers Southern California, Southern Nevada, Northern Central Arizona, and Southern Utah. So this is a very large trail. The Southern Fox Song Trail was used for, trade and getting people to where they needed to go as well. However, one of the purposes of the Southern Fox Song Trail was to act as a blanket. So it is the blanket that balances the resources of the earth with the resources of the sky. So whoever travels on the Southern Fox Song Trail can call for resources if they need anything. However, those resources will only come to them if they are maintaining that balance as well. So if you look at where these hotspots are in conjunction with the trails that are here, there's a pretty important picture that emerges, because all of the trails either have all of the hotspots adjacent to them, or they cut straight through the center in the case of the southern resources, the southern lakeshore resources and sites that are there as well. So people know that this is going to be a place where they can stop through their travels, kind of rest and recoup. Maybe they can encounter other people or check in with other people who they know, and kind of stock up before they move through. So those pot drops that are on the eastern portion where my cursor is actually off of the Southern Fox Song Trail, which is pretty interesting. That's the location there. So you can either think maybe those vessels could have been, like water canteens that people would have brought, or they could have been intentionally left and dropped kind of as an offering to keep balance with the trail too. And I took the map that you guys had seen earlier that was done by Bean et al., and I geo-referenced it in ArcGIS Pro. So that's why this looks a little bit different than what you saw. So I tethered known places that are on that map, whether they are mountain ranges or towns or cities, or springs. That was actually how I got it to work, was by finding the locations of the springs, and then the map actually made sense. And you tag it to a known location and a location on the map, and it kind of stretches it out and gives you a more accurate picture of where everything is. So what does all of this mean? What am I going to do with this, especially now that my master's thesis is done? So I'm arguing that Ivanpah was a logistical hub for varying subsistence strategies. So people used this lake as it was expanding and as it was receding for a variety of different things. And when you're looking at the lake, since I looked at it as a landscape rather than a piecemeal approach, it seems pretty apparent that Ivanpah is a cultural landscape or a traditional cultural property. So it meets National Register of Historic Places nomination for either of these designations. There have been 2 attempts for National Register nomination of Ivanpah that have happened in the past, and neither of them have gone through because they basically, the National Register said that they needed more data. Well, I have an abundance of data. I probably have the most data on Ivanpah out of anyone else. So the future direction here is to work on an NRHP nomination as a cultural landscape to preserve this area. Obviously, it's been impacted by a whole lot. There's I-15, which is the top picture here. You also have the Prim Valley Golf Club. Why they decided to build a golf club there is beyond me. And the Ivanpah Solar Electric Generating Station, as well as the southern area, which has been destroyed by Molycorp Mine. So there's a lot of different things that have happened there. So the landscape really needs to be preserved because this is a very important and sacred spot. So looking out wider, there's a real need for survey of, honestly, Ivanpah as a whole, but definitely nearby dry lakes, because this brine shrimp or tadpole shrimp adaptation after these lakes have dried is probably regional, and there's no reason to think that that giant gap between Ivanpah and the Snake River Plain of Idaho is actually barren of these features. So some future directions that we're working on is a drone survey. We're going to do a drone survey specifically of the fishing feature complex to see the full boundaries of it, as well as some field recording in the spring, so in a couple of months, for the phyllopod features, because Barb Ross is being very generous and is lending me her field school students to record it, so that is a great opportunity. And these pictures here are really important because they weren't just grabbed from Google. I know when they were posted, and they were posted by actual people. So the top picture is what Ivanpah looked like after the 2022 summer monsoons, where it filled the lake. That's a lot of standing water, and this is after we hadn't gotten any rain in a minute. So the water that is collected in that basin, it stays there for quite a bit. It takes a long time to dry out. And actually, after it rains, the BLM just shuts down all access to the off-roading areas of Ivanpah because people's vehicles will just get stuck. And the bottom is someone who was out there after one of the rains and posted on Explorers of the Mojave Desert, a very fun Facebook group, and said, hey, I'm out at Ivanpah and I'm wondering what these little critters are. There's a ton of them that are here, and I haven't seen them before. Can anyone tell me? And that was the final confirmation that I needed that Ivanpah was indeed a shrimp camp, and that these little tadpole shrimp guys are still there and they're alive and well. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. So Kara, we got a couple questions that came in while you were talking. So this is Jim. He says, given their incredibly small size, I'm mystified how brine shrimp could have provided enough protein for even a small group of humans.
Yeah, so if I'm using brine shrimp and like regular shrimp as an analog, like regular ocean shrimp are actually one of the highest. They have a really high protein to weight ratio. So like what you're getting is like primarily protein out of them. And so when these hatch, it's not just like one or two, it's hundreds of them. So on their own, not a huge thing. But when you can capture a lot of them, it's a considerable boost to the diet. And it wouldn't have been a primary subsistence food. This is kind of like an accessory, sort of. So if you're thinking about how you process them into a paste, whether that is ground from being dry, or if you're processing them when, you know, they're like wet, that's a food additive. So it's something that you can add to a stew that you're making, or if you're making like meal cakes out of so beaver dam breadroot, for instance, which I think is a strong contender for one of the wetland plants that they were processing there. You can make those into little cakes to eat. And if you can add protein into that, then that's really advantageous. So you can think of this as just like kind of like a supplement to your diet. So, and I see Jim's second question too about the proposed Ivanpah Airport. Do you mind if I jump to that one too?
That's great. Go ahead.
So that's actually one of the purposes of the proposed, like of the National Register nomination, because the airport has kind of been on again, off again for a long time. Even if we're not looking at it from a cultural resources perspective, I think that it's a really poor idea to decide to put an airport there because, you know, we saw how the lake flooded for 2022. It also flooded last year with a fill and then also a landslide that happened because not landslide, it turned into a flash flood area. So the water kind of figured out how to make its own channel out of I-15, and it washed away a ton of vehicles and stranded a lot of people on the highway for hours. So the idea of putting an airport there is just like absolutely terrible, in my opinion. But from a cultural resources perspective, that's why I'm going for such a large nomination as a cultural landscape or traditional cultural property, because that's going to cover the largest area and that's going to afford it the most protection. So you're going to need like the ethnography to back that up. And I have that as well because there's been fortunately a good amount of ethnography that's been done for past projects, which really bolster my argument there. So I would like to put in the National Register nomination to kill the proposed airport project entirely. And that project has been going on for a long time. I know since I moved out here to Las Vegas in 2018, there has been talk about the airport, and sometimes it's on, sometimes it's off, and hopefully the National Register nomination will just make it off for good.
We hear a lot about that airport
Yeah.
and concerns, and you know, they do need to figure out where to put the airport, but yeah, think of it logically and protect our cultural resources as well as recreation and other things that happen. So let's see. Leslie asks, I'm not sure exactly where the rail to LA is going to run, but have you considered the impact it might have on the cultural area? Have you?
Yeah. Yeah, so that one is fortunately less of a concern because the high-speed rail project, which is greenlit, and actually some of the beginning stages of construction have already started. And they are using the existing corridor that is of I-15. So it's it's the corridor that's in between the incoming and outgoing lanes. So there will be some impact to cultural resources, but generally that corridor has already been disturbed by construction of Interstate 15. So that one I'm not super concerned about. And because that project is already pushed through, I don't think that there's any amount of pushback that I could do to change that one. However, you do have like a view shed issue when you are looking at the landscape of like what the visual area potential effect is. And even the construction of the Ivanpah solar electric generating station, which hasn't impacted the lake a ton, but it's impacted the cultural landscape a lot. The Southern Paiute were pretty irritated with the construction of that because it interferes with the view of the Clark Mountains. And the Clark Mountains are known to hold a lot of power for the Southern Paiute people, and the generating station there is very disruptive to that. And the power output, I don't know the exact proposed output when the station was originally constructed, but the actual output of ice eggs, so like the generating station, is significantly less than it was claimed, and is generally considered to be like a power failure for what it was supposed to do. So people are still very irritated about that, and I'm sure that the high-speed rail is also going to make people really angry, but the impact to actual cultural sites is fairly minimal because of that. And one of the nice parts about the high-speed rail actually is that it has given archaeologists in the Mojave a fair amount of bargaining power to get what they want for the high-speed rail construction. So I know in some cases there have been like complete ethnographies that have been demanded by archaeologists, basically as like some sort of payment for the high-speed rail going through. Because the project is greenlit, then we do need to get something back for the cultural resources and for the indigenous people in the area. So there's like some bartering that's going on there.
So I had a question while you were presenting, and maybe other people had the same question. So when you're a novice or you're not a trained archaeologist and you go out onto a dry lake, how were you able to tell the difference between these circular features and the thermal features? Because the Joe public would just see, oh, hey, there's some rocks, right?
Mm-hmm.
So can you just explain that just briefly for us?
Yeah, so while there's a lot of different like rocks that are there, generally none of the rocks, especially in the lake interior, are going to be from there. So at a minimum, they're already considered manuports. So that's when something is carried by a person from one place to another. Even if there's nothing at all, even if it's just one boulder, like that's already a manuport because that doesn't belong in the middle of the lake. So the thermal features, though, they're constructed of rock all the way through. And so the diameter of them is approximately a meter. And the circular features have a clearing in the center. So it's just like the ring. There might be a pile of boulders that's off to a side, but there's nothing that's in the interior of that feature. And when we found those, I actually was thinking, I was like, oh, well, this could be maybe related to like historic activity, because I've done a lot of historical archaeology, and I surveyed the area and I didn't find any historics. And I was thinking just because it's like by the railroad, and it's not even by the railroad. The railroad is this line that's here. So it's actually off quite a bit from the railroad, but that's the closest historic thing that I could think of. And it just doesn't belong on the landscape. And like I showed with the picture of the quarry or the outcrop that's there, I'll see if I can go to that really quick. Nope, nope. Okay, so the quarry is like covered in rocks of all different kinds, and there's no patterns that kind of pop out to you. But the area where the circular features are, you can tell that these rocks are arranged in some kind of meaningful pattern. And that's where the drone survey would come in handy, because identifying features like this from pedestrian survey are really difficult, because sometimes you're just not going to see them that well. And I'm sure that there's more stuff that's actually in those rock outcrops that like I just couldn't see because there's so much background noise. So if you're like a new archaeologist, or if you are maybe just like an avocationalist and you care a lot about cultural preservation, it's really just looking for the things that don't really belong on the landscape. If it were to just be like a natural occurrence, it looks like there's some level of human interference that's there. So I hope that that kind of helps. Also telling there's a way that you can kind of tell if rocks are fire affected or not. And you can definitely tell that with the thermal features, because like some of the rocks will be cracked and splintered. Whereas the rocks that are here with the circular features are whole, and they don't look like they've had any kind of like fire affecting that's happened to them.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. And first, every time I see circles like that, I'm thinking, oh, they're on a playa and they've got a circle. Maybe they were securing a brush shelter or something like that, and they were building up the rocks around the outside to help. But I think this is fascinating information about, the brine shrimp and utilizing those resources. And what this may tell us for the future of other dry lakes throughout Nevada as a whole, because like you said, it's scattered all over the place. We have all these dry lakes, and for any of you who have been out and seen these different brine shrimp and other things, they definitely look like they belong, like they're fossils, right? It's like these fossils have come back to life, and they're a great food source for other animals and stuff. So they are part of this whole continuing system. I was working at an archaeological site and the ravens came. I was like, why are these ravens here? And it was a Tanaha, right? So the water catchment that's up on the top of the rocks, and it filled with enough water long enough that these things hatched, right? They had the right, and so they were just having their shrimp, for a while, and then they leave, and then maybe the birds even know, hey, we got a good rain, let's go check out these couple areas where they are. So really fascinating research, Karen. I really appreciate you sharing it with us.
Yeah, thanks for being interested. And also, like with birds, usually these brine shrimp hatches are often signaled by migratory birds first. So obviously, if you live in the area and you're very familiar with the landscape, you'll probably know already, like, oh, there's a rain that came through. I have this dry lake that's over here, or the Tanahas that are like over in that mountain range. I'm gonna go there because I know what's going on. But also, like, the birds just know. So like follow the birds, and then you get, not only do you get shrimp, but you also get some birds. So
yeah, and a lot of us have eaten different kinds of food with fish sauce in it, and so I'm thinking a little adding some fish paste to different things could be a big treat, like you said, that protein boost, and salts and all kinds of other good things that you can get from there. So it'd be interesting to see if they could store it, and that type of thing, since you have the ceramics and stuff there. I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too. And something that I should have mentioned as well, in the case of there was some work that was out at Soda Lake and also on the Snake River Plain of Idaho. They've tested groundstone that's like associated with these features, and they test positive for the shrimp protein, so whatever taxa is there. So so you can also do protein residue tests to see like if there's actually the presence of the shrimp protein. And I think especially in the case of ceramics, that would be really cool. I'm positive that the associated groundstone with these features is going to hit for the shrimp, but I'm really curious if there's any protein hits for the shrimp that are on the ceramic shards there, because like you're mentioning with that storage, whether they're using the vessels for cooking or for storing or just like transport. So if you're thinking, because these areas are also right next to these trails, you have this hub where you can gather a lot of resources and carry them somewhere else. So yeah, some really cool things to think about.
Yeah. Well, Ted here says he wants fish tacos now too. He says stop talking about the shrimp. And again, thank you so much for sharing this information with us, and the issues for the area that have happened and may come up. So it gives a different perspective. So thank you again. And thank you to everybody who joined us this evening. I hope you can join us again next month for our next speaker series. And I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend down here in Las Vegas. We're supposed to have excellent weather. So get out, explore, have a good time, and enjoy nature.
Thank you so much.